I don't try to understand the emotional bond that I feel for Grandpa Goldman. It is simply there, durable, present, always strong. I was 6 months old when Grandpa died in 1953, so I never knew him, never called him Grandpa. So the very fact that we are having this weekend to honor Grandpa Goldman brings me actually to tears. And the fact that the idea for this weekend was not even mine, but a suggestion that began at a staff discussion about my final year at MICA, and that then the retirement committee grabbed at the proposal, brings even more tears. And finally, the fact that you decided to call the weekend the Grandpa Goldman Weekend is what? Some sentences are simply unfinishable. Tonight, I'll give you a brief overview of Grandpa and his career. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll actually study some of the texts from his voluminous scholarship and writings. Where to begin? There is simply no doubt that Grandpa Goldman was one of the major figures in American Jewish life in the first half of the 20th century. At Grandma Goldman's funeral in January 1994, she lived a vital life to the grand age of 96, a full 41 years after my grandfather's death. My brief remarks about her included the following, and now this is a quote from those remarks in 1994. Grandma, you were married to one of the great Jewish figures of the 20th century. With him, you met and entertained them all. Stephen Wise, Louis Brandeis, Albert Einstein, Chaim Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Maurice Samuel. I remember casually telling you, Grandma, on a visit home while I was in rabbinical school, that I was reading a collection of essays by Harav Avraham Kook, the revered, beloved, and even progressive first chief rabbi of Palestine. You then told me how Rav Kook had visited in your home in Cleveland and had tea, and you had even bought a new teapot for the occasion. Your comment on Louis Ginsburg, perhaps the greatest Talmudist of the 20th century to live on this continent, was that when he visited in your home in Chicago, he commented how spacious the closets were. Through you, the Jewish luminaries of the age became simply human beings, and you witnessed up close some of the greatest Jewish events of the first half of the 20th century. You had box seats at the World Zionist Congress in late August 1939 in Switzerland, where Grandpa presided as president of the Zionist Organization of America. In the entryway in our home, just a couple of miles from here, we have a photograph of you speaking, and I see one delegate in the back kind of falling asleep to Grandpa's remarks in this wonderful photo. But I remember you're telling me Grandpa's account of Chaim Weizmann's abrupt ending of the convention 4 days early. The convention was scheduled to last through August 28th. Weizmann walked into the assembled auditorium and ended the Congress on August 24th. Everyone knew the war in Europe was about to start. And you told me of your and Grandpa going to the coast to get the ship back to the safety of North America, the United States, and of the tears that were shed, especially with the European delegates as they made their way back to their home. My eulogy for my grandmother reflected on the story she had told me while I sat as a child on the end of her bed in our Chicago apartment where she lived with us. Grandma Goldman, as I said, had a front row seat to 20th century Jewish history as her husband shaped the American Jewish future. And when I'm in my very, very, very best moments, I know in part of me that part of me comes from him. Grandpa was born in Russia, in Kozin, a village in Volhynia, present-day Ukraine, in 1893. He came to this country at the age of 6, settling in Brooklyn. You can read an objective account of my grandfather's life in the biography written about him by Jacob Weinstein, a younger Chicago colleague, who, by the way, was Abner Mikva's beloved Chicago rabbi. But this evening is not objective. My grandfather grew up in a fiercely observant immigrant Orthodox home. After studying as a youth all the way through to his early 20s at the Isaac Elchanan Yeshiva, where his classmates included both Abba Hillel Silver and Louis Finkelstein, he went on to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where he became the prize student of the luminous faculty in that era that included Solomon Schechter, Louis Ginsburg, and Mordechai Kaplan. An indication that my grandfather was the star alumnus of the seminary is that he was the first recipient of the Solomon Schechter Award that was established by the seminary some years after Schechter's death in 1915. That is an award that is still given out by the seminary to this day. After completing the seminary, Grandpa was offered a teaching position there, but according to my grandmother, my grandfather was too much an activist to be tied to an academic institution that he thought even then was rooted in the 19th century. He therefore launched his career as a rabbi by leaving New York and going to Cleveland. Now, what kind of rabbi was he in the congregational world? The two phrases or the two terms that I've picked up over the years that describe my grandfather are independent-minded and serious scholar. Grandpa Goldman, it seems, always marched to his own beat, as you'll see tomorrow. But a few stories this evening. His first rabbinic role tells the story of what was to come when he gets to Cleveland. The Cleveland Jewish Center, under his very young leadership, soon became, and this is remarkable, but according to what I've read in several places is true, it became the largest synagogue in the country with over 1,500 families. It was not without struggles, however, that Grandpa led the congregation from its Eastern European Orthodox roots into the then new and unfolding world of conservative Judaism. Success and change brought pushback from those who simply liked things the way they had been. Where have we heard that before? A large and powerful minority of the congregation set themselves in firm opposition to my grandfather's liberalizing ways. According to historical accounts, those who were genuinely motivated by loyalty to Orthodox practice were joined by some who simply didn't like my grandfather and or change. Synagogues don't change that much. So Grandpa's opponents were both organized, and they also had recourse to an old set of synagogue bylaws which gave any group of 5 members the power to veto changes in religious practice. Some bylaws. When my grandfather refused to make concessions to the dissidents, they took their case to the rabbinical court of the Union of Orthodox Rabbis in New York. Grandpa was summoned to New York to appear before the Beit Din. He, of course, refused to go, refusing to recognize the authority of the court, claiming he was not bound by any Orthodox body decision. This was the first of my grandfather's many encounters with the Orthodox establishment of this country. Eventually, he was placed in cherem, or excommunicated, by the Orthodox Beit Din. And Grandma used to tell me that the excommunication delighted him, as it placed him in the company of Maimonides, Spinoza, and Herzl, each of whom at various times were excommunicated by rabbinical authorities. But back to Grandpa in Cleveland, whose dissidents did not stop. They took their case to court by filing a lawsuit with the District Court of Cuyahoga County with charges, quote, violation of the Constitution and bylaws which establishes the congregation as an Orthodox or traditional congregation, end of quote. The case, when it came to trial, was heralded in the American Jewish press as the first heresy trial of a rabbi in an American court, end of quote. 38 itemized complaints were listed in the charges against Grandpa. Among them, again now a reading from the court records, quote, by permitting Goldman to announce publicly that the 5 books of Moses were not inspired by God and are not written by Moses, that the 10 commandments were not given or revealed by God to Moses at Sinai. These are all quotes. By forbidding the mourners in the congregation to say Kaddish individually to the congregation. By permitting eating without saying grace or covering the head. By permitting the kissing of bride by the rabbi during marriage ceremonies. by permitting the rabbi to carry books openly through the streets on the Sabbath, by permitting the rabbi to urge the congregation to read The Mind in the Making, that's the book, by James Harvey Robinson, which publication is hostile to and a denial of Orthodox Judaism, by permitting the rabbi to partake of meals at hotels and restaurants without inquiring concerning kashrut, by permitting the rabbi to make of the synagogue a hotbed of radicalism by inviting speakers widely known for their radical tendencies. These are great. The plaintiffs demanded, the Constitution adopted by the congregation in November 1924 be set aside in favor of the original Constitution of 1917, that the congregational properties be returned to those in the congregation who would dedicate them to the cause of Orthodox or traditional Judaism. End of quote. Isn't this great? My grandfather replied to these charges in court with a lecture on rabbinics and Jewish history. Again, a quote here. Defendant denies that the term traditional is synonymous with Orthodox as applied to Judaism and asserts there has been no governing body of Jewish congregations for the past 1,800 years. Each congregation makes up a separate entity responsible to itself without control by any other organization. There's never been a rigid definition of creed, and the term Orthodox has not had a meaning in the Jewish religion until the last century. There are three so-called groups of Jewish congregations in this country: Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. All of them designate themselves as traditional. End of quote. Needless to say, the court held with my grandfather and dismissed the matter entirely. Grandpa was not afraid of dissidents, complainers, and he might have even liked a good fight. He eventually left Cleveland to go on to Chicago in 1929 and became the rabbi of the Anshe Emet Synagogue, which again, under his leadership from 1929 to 1953, became then the largest congregation in the country. More on Chicago tomorrow. Grandpa was also a Zionist leader, and here he also showed independence. He became president of the Zionist Organization of America with the support of Louis Brandeis, and Grandpa moved the Zionist Organization of American offices out of New York here to Washington, D.C. Why? He sought to gain independence and a stronger, clearer Zionist voice away from the larger and more entrenched Jewish, non-Zionist, and anti-Zionist organizations that dominated the New York and therefore national Jewish scene at the time. Incidentally, in terms of his being a kind of rebel, his presidency of the Zionist Organization of America came as a nomination from the floor of the convention. He was not the chosen nominee of the nominating committee. He was instrumental in shaping Zionist strategy of opposing the British White Paper on Palestine, which limited Jewish immigration in those critical and tragic years. He sided with Ben-Gurion on fighting Hitler as if there were no white paper, and fighting the white paper as if there were no Hitler. And tomorrow we'll review some of the letters of Grandpa between my grandfather and other American Jewish leaders who were very, very, very reluctant, even in those critical days of the 30s, to pour money into supporting getting Jews out of Europe. His commitment to building a Jewish homeland in Palestine are legendary. His firm belief in Hebrew as the lifeblood of the Jewish people was integral to his Judaism. His sermons on this score are breathtaking to read. His fights with major Jewish figures and organizations will be highlighted again tomorrow. His attacks on the reform movement of the time and its anti-Zionism are breathtaking. Next. Within his own conservative movement, Grandpa made heads spin. He was relentless in his liberalism and his demands for a truly progressive Judaism. This is what he did at the synagogue I grew up in, but mind you, he did this in the 1930s. In the 1930s. 1, he began counting women in the minyan. He institutionalized bat mitzvah for women. He included musical instruments in services on Shabbat, and he installed an organ in the 1930s. He began counting one-day holiday of the festivals, 7 days of Pesach, 7 days of Sukkot, 1 day of Shavuot. He shortened the liturgy dramatically, including the elimination of the reader's repetition of the Amida and near elimination of Musaf. When I read this sermon to Louise said, "What's Musaf?" Because we are committed Reformed Jews. Musaf is the additional Amida service on Shabbat and holidays, which Reform has eliminated. In the prayer book that he created, he included readings from everyone from Aristotle to Shakespeare. I'll bring a copy of the prayer book tomorrow. In every area of Jewish life, my grandfather was a progressive thinker. He constantly criticized his own conservative movement, especially his alma mater, the Jewish Theological Seminary, for dragging its feet on crucial religious issues regarding women, liturgy, and Jewish law. Much has been written, volumes have been written by American Jewish historians about his deep philosophical arguments with his lifelong friend and seminary chancellor, Louis Finkelstein. They perhaps created the definition of the time of frenemies. It's remarkable the challenges he brought against Finkelstein in the seminary for not doing anything to create a truly American Judaism. He was a progressive liberal. The seminary remained for him a bastion of orthodoxy. And to the extent that the seminary was a bastion of orthodoxy, just to give you an idea, when I was graduating rabbinical school, college in 1974, I first went to the seminary I grew up in the conservative movement. The seminary in 1974 in its own synagogue had separate seating of men and women. Okay? It remained an orthodox institution in every way. I say progressive liberal when Grandpa was actually a committed socialist. He is reported to have voted for Norman Thomas for president each time Thomas ran. Finally, and for me deeply personal, in addition to being the rabbi of the synagogue I grew up in, my grandfather was the founder of the Anshe Emet Day School, the first non-Orthodox Jewish day school in the United States. This is an outstanding school that continues to thrive on the north side of Chicago. The more I look back on my life, the more I know that this school and its environment, for me, were truly formative. The school was and is a model of what is best described as a school of Tarbut Ivri, Tarbut Zioni, Tarbut Yisraeli, Tarbut Yehudi. For those of you who do not know the Hebrew, it's a model of Hebrew, Zionist, Israeli, Jewish culture. There is Bible study, Hebrew literature, along with all the secular studies. There is no daily prayer. What Jewish summer camp is for many in creating their Jewish souls, the Anshe Emet Day School was for me. I cherish the pure sweetness of my memories of those days in that school. Grandpa created a child-centered school. Its board and governance totally independent of the synagogue. My grandfather wanted the parents and teachers together collaborating on what the school should be. It's a remarkable place. I was invited to speak there several years ago. I think it was 2000. This shows that I'm a White Sox fan, not a Cub fan. I was invited to speak there the year that the Cubs won the World Series. Was that 2017, 2018? What's that? 16, thank you. You see, my White Sox bona fides. It's actually, I spoke there in 2016, and the date had been arranged. I'm kind of go off script here in order to talk about baseball. What else? My plane landed in Chicago. I took the first flight out of National here, the earliest flight in the morning I could, because I wanted to spend the full day in Chicago before I was speaking that evening. The flight I took happened to be the morning after the Cubs won the World Series, beating Cleveland in Cleveland. So I get to Chicago early in the morning, at about 8 o'clock in the morning. The hotel I was staying at was on the north side, the closest hotel to Wrigley Field, because Anshe Emet, the synagogue and the day school, were a stone's throw from Wrigley Field. I mean, a short 4 or 5 block walk. The hotel is a couple blocks away. So I get to the front desk, and the guy is fast asleep. Everybody had stayed up drinking, celebrating all night. So I dumped my bag, and I walked to Wrigley Field there. I'm a White Sox fan, but I'll kind of make the pilgrimage. Well, everybody from Chicago was walking there. People were kissing the walls, like going to the hotel, but I mean, kissing. the outside wall. I mean, the gates were locked, but people were walking around kind of kissing the wall of Wrigley Field. I kind of was looking on, but it was staggering. And then I spoke at the day school that night. But I talked to teachers and such that evening, and so much of the curriculum remained what the curriculum had been. I was told by my grandmother and others that my grandfather's closest rabbinic colleagues in Chicago were actually two Reform rabbis. One went on to great fame in Boston, Joshua Loth Liebman, and Felix Levy, a noted Chicago rabbi for many, many years. Finally, and perhaps above all, Grandpa was a serious student of nearly everything. As a rabbinical student at the seminary, he also enrolled at Columbia's Teachers College in order to study with John Dewey, who clearly was an enormous influence as seen in his writings. He also simultaneously studied both Greek and Latin at New York University. From immigrant Yiddish-speaking child to a true American rabbinic genius, this is his story. In my younger years, I was told by both rabbis and scholars that knew him that his familiarity with rabbinic literature was almost without peer. His private library at the time of his death consisted of some 26,000 volumes of Judaica and was considered the largest such private collection of Jewish books in the United States. His own writings consisted of a critical study of the philosophy of Maimonides, 3 volumes on the Bible entitled The Book of Human Destiny. This was his unfinished life's work project. He authored a book on Louis Brandeis, as well as several volumes of essays and other critical works on Hebrew writers. Tomorrow I'm going to bring you a copy of every single book that he wrote. In eulogizing him, one of his closest friends, Maurice Samuel, who spoke at his funeral, wrote the following, a quote. This is a quote from the eulogy of Maurice Samuel. By the way, a Yale University scholar just put out a study on the work of Maurice Samuel, who himself was a great figure, a deeply learned Jewish scholar in this country. But this is what Maurice Samuel said, quote, "We speak of him as the ideal rabbi. For as it was said of Rabbi Eliezer ben Shimon, and now Samuel is quoting the Talmud, it may be said of him, that he was, quote, the Karavah, Tanya, Paitan, V'darshan, master of the Bible, profound student of rabbinics, poet in literary style, and preacher by the grace of God." Maurice Samuel continued in his eulogy, quote, "The more I delve into his letters, the more saddened I feel that so vigorous a personality and so keen an intellect has been taken from us long before his work was done. In the entire panorama of Jewish life, there is not another Solomon Goldman, so statesmanlike and perceptive in judgment, so subtle in reasoning, so rich in erudition, so deeply in love with the dynamic spirit of Judaism, so reverent of learning, so scornful of vulgarity and sham, so courageous in battle for the integrity of Judaism, so generous and self-sacrificing at every turn in life. Whenever we of this generation gather to plan for the revitalization of our sacred tradition, liberating it from the cliches of managers, the slogans of bureaucrats, and the prejudices of vulgarians, the spirit of Solomon Goldman and his blessed memory are with us." End of quote. That guy could write. To summarize, my grandfather was a warrior in the battle for American Jewish liberalism and liberal Zionism. There's a line that I love written by Ariel Sabar of our own community, and many of you have heard me read this line before. Quote, "We are who we come from as much as who we make of ourselves." End of quote. Although I never knew my grandpa, his influence is always there shaping me. Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the memory of the righteous is a blessing. Shabbat Shalom, Amen, and thank you to all of you for being the willing students of Grandpa Goldman.